The enslaved population grew rapidly. By 1845, when Texas was annexed by the United States, there were approximately 30,000 enslaved people in Texas, a six-fold increase in less than a decade. That growth was not accidental. The Republic actively encouraged slaveholders from the American South to immigrate, bringing their enslaved people with them. The promise of cheap land and no restrictions on slavery was a powerful draw. What slavery meant on the Texas frontier. Slavery in Texas in the 1830s and 1840s had some characteristics that differed from slavery in the older plantation states of the American South. The cotton economy was still developing. The plantations were smaller and less established. The legal infrastructure of slavery, the slave patrols, the pass systems, the elaborate codes that governed the lives of enslaved people in states like Virginia and South Carolina, was less developed, simply because the Republic was new.
But this relative underdevelopment of the formal apparatus of slavery did not make the institution less brutal. In many ways, the frontier context made it more so. There were fewer witnesses. Legal accountability for violence against enslaved people was even more theoretical than in the established states, and the constant possibility of Comanche raids, Mexican military incursions, and general frontier chaos created an atmosphere of violence and instability that fell hardest on the most vulnerable. Enslaved people on the Texas frontier worked as field laborers on cotton plantations, as domestic servants, as skilled tradespeople, blacksmiths, carpenters, cooks. Some worked in dangerous conditions on the frontier itself, building the infrastructure of settlement that would make Anglo-Texan expansion possible. Mexico as freedom, the underground flight south. Here is something that the standard Texas history almost never mentions. Mexico, which Texas had just fought a revolution against, represented freedom to the enslaved people of Texas. Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829. When the Texas Revolution resulted in independence from Mexico, it also eliminated the legal protection that Mexican law had technically offered to enslaved people in Texas. For those who had known about this protection, independence was not a liberation, it was a catastrophe. Some enslaved people fled south, across the Rio Grande, into Mexico, where slavery was illegal and where the Mexican government would not return them to their enslavers. This underground movement south was the mirror image of the Underground Railroad that ran north in the established United States. In Texas, freedom lay not to the north, but to the south. The Texas government knew about this and was alarmed by it. The Texas Rangers were partly organized to intercept enslaved people attempting to escape to Mexico. Diplomatic pressure was applied to Mexico to return escapees, pressure that Mexico consistently refused. When Mexico pointed out that the people fleeing south were legally free under Mexican law, Texan authorities responded with fury. The refusal to return escapees was cited as one of the ongoing provocations from Mexico that eventually justified annexation and war. Think about that for a moment. The refusal of Mexico to return people to slavery was treated, by Texas and eventually by the United States, as an act of aggression. The specific human beings. The historical record of enslaved people in the Texas Republic is incomplete, fragmentary, and deliberately obscured. Enslaved people were counted in census records as property, by number, not by name. Their stories were rarely written down by the people living them. What survives comes from fragments, court records, estate inventories, rare personal accounts, the recollections of formerly enslaved people recorded decades later. We know that enslaved people built the first buildings in many Texas settlements. We know that they cleared land, planted crops, tended livestock, and performed the fundamental labor that made Anglo-Texan settlement economically viable. We know that they cooked food, raised children, maintained households.
We know that some of them resisted, through escape attempts, through subtle defiance, through the preservation of culture and community in the face of a system designed to destroy both. We know that many of them watched the Republic of Texas come into existence with full knowledge of what it meant for them, that the legal ambiguity of their status under Mexican law had been replaced by constitutional certainty about their permanent enslavement. Their names are mostly lost, their stories are mostly untold, but they were there. They built what was built, and the silence around their lives is not an accident. It is a choice that historians are still in the process of reversing. The political consequence, slavery and annexation. The enslaved people of Texas were not, of course, political actors in the Republic. They could not vote, could not hold office, could not organize publicly. But the fact of their presence and the fact of slavery as a constitutional foundation of the new republic shaped every political decision about Texas for the next decade. The question of whether to admit Texas to the United States was fundamentally a question about whether to expand slavery. Every Northern congressman who voted against annexation, every Northern newspaper that condemned Texas statehood, every abolitionist who made Texas a cause, they were all grappling with the reality of those 30,000 enslaved people and the constitutional structure that kept them enslaved. And every Southern congressman who demanded Texas annexation, every planter who immigrated to Texas with his enslaved workforce, every politician who saw Texas as the key to maintaining Southern political power in Washington, they were all calculating on the basis of that same reality. The enslaved people of Texas had no power in this debate, but they were, in a very real sense, what the debate was about. For 9 years, Texas applied for admission to the United States. For 9 years, the United States said no. This is not how most Americans learn this history. The standard story goes, Texas won independence, applied to join the United States, and was admitted. The decade in between is treated as a brief pause, an administrative formality.
It was not. It was 9 years of desperate, complicated, often humiliating diplomacy, punctuated by financial crisis, military invasion, political scandal, and the very real possibility that the Republic of Texas would simply collapse before the United States ever agreed to take it. 3 presidents and 3 rejections. Andrew Jackson, Houston's old mentor, the man who had shaped Houston's political career, the man who had fought alongside him decades before. Jackson was sympathetic to Texas, but he recognized reality. In the final weeks of his presidency in 1836, he extended formal diplomatic recognition to the Republic of Texas, a gesture of friendship, but he refused annexation. The political cost was too high. The slave state question would split his party. He passed. Martin Van Buren, Jackson's chosen successor, a New York Democrat more sensitive to Northern anti-slavery opinion than Jackson had been. Van Buren had no particular warmth for Texas and no desire to fight the political battle that annexation would require. He also faced an enormous economic crisis. The Panic of 1837 had devastated the American economy and had no bandwidth for a divisive territorial expansion. He passed. John Tyler, a Virginia slaveholder who had broken with both major parties and became president through the back door when William Henry Harrison died just a month into office. Tyler was personally enthusiastic about annexation. He was a Southerner who understood exactly what Texas's admission would mean for slave state power. He tried to get annexation through the Senate in 1844, submitting a treaty. The Senate rejected it. 35 votes against, only 16 in favor. The opposition was not simply Northern. Some senators who opposed annexation were worried not about slavery per se, but about the risk of war with Mexico. Others were concerned about the financial implications of absorbing a bankrupt republic. Others were playing partisan politics. But the thread running through most of the opposition was the slavery question. The fear that annexing Texas would tip the balance of power decisively toward the slave states and make peaceful resolution of the slavery crisis impossible. The British option, Houston's masterstroke. Sam Houston was many things, a drunk, sometimes, a demagogue, occasionally, but above all, he was a strategist. And while American presidents were declining to annex Texas, Houston was playing a longer game. He began, quietly and carefully, to flirt with Britain. Britain had its own interests in Texas. The British had abolished slavery throughout their empire in 1833, and British abolitionists were actively looking for ways to check the expansion of American slavery. A free, independent Texas, ideally one that had abolished slavery under British influence, would serve as a check on American expansionism and provide British merchants with access to a major cotton-producing region without going through the American South. The British government began exploratory conversations with Texas about trade relationships, protection agreements, and potentially even something approaching a protectorate arrangement. The details were never formalized, and it's a matter of historical debate how
seriously Britain actually intended to follow through. But the conversations were real, and they were visible to American politicians. Houston understood that American politicians feared British influence in Texas far more than they feared the abstract question of Texas statehood. He used this knowledge with surgical precision. Texas's diplomatic conversations with Britain were never quite secret enough to be deniable, and never quite public enough to constitute a commitment. They were calibrated to alarm. And they worked. the Texas-Mexico War that never ended. While this diplomatic game was being played in Washington and London, Mexico was continuing to remind Texas of its vulnerability. In 1842, Mexican General Rafael Vázquez led a raid into Texas that briefly occupied San Antonio. His force withdrew after a few days. It was not a full-scale invasion, but a demonstration, a message: we have not accepted your independence. We can reach your capital whenever we choose. Later that same year, a larger Mexican force under General Adrian Wool occupied San Antonio for 9 days. Texan militia eventually drove the force back across the Rio Grande, but the pattern was unmistakable. Texas could not defend itself from Mexican military incursions. Its army was too small, too poorly funded, too dependent on militia volunteers who had farms to attend to and families to protect. These incursions created panic in the Texas Republic and reinforced for many Texans the argument that annexation was not a choice but a necessity. They could not survive as an independent republic indefinitely. They needed the military protection of the United States. They also created an opportunity. Every Mexican incursion was another argument that Houston could make in Washington. Texas is under threat. We cannot hold on alone. If you will not take us, we may have to find other friends. The Mere Expedition, Recklessness and Catastrophe. In December 1842, a group of about 300 Texan volunteers, motivated by raid at Mexican incursions and operating without official sanction from the Texas government, crossed the Rio Grande and attacked the Mexican town of Mere. They were surrounded and captured after a prolonged battle. Santa Anna, who was back in power in Mexico, ordered them executed. His general on the ground, Pedro de Ampudia, argued against a mass execution. Santa Anna compromised. They would draw lots. 1 in 10 men would be executed. The rest would be sent to prison. The Texans drew beans from a jar. White beans meant life, black beans meant death. 17 men drew black beans and were shot. The black bean lottery became one of the most discussed events in Texas in 1843. It generated enormous emotional response: outrage, grief, calls for revenge. It was also, in the broader context, a story of Texan recklessness producing catastrophic consequences. The men
who crossed the Rio Grande had not been ordered to do so. They had violated the policy of the Texas government. Their deaths were real and horrifying, but they were not the result of an unprovoked Mexican atrocity. Houston, characteristically, tried to use the event diplomatically, even as he condemned the unauthorized expedition itself. Every atrocity was ammunition. Every piece of ammunition moved the United States a little closer to acting. In the next section, we'll show you the election that changed everything, the dark horse candidate who became president on a promise of expansion, and why the decision he made about Texas would drag America into its bloodiest foreign war. The election of 1844, the dark horse. The presidential election of 1844 was supposed to be between two known quantities. Henry Clay, the great Whig statesman and 3-time presidential candidate, was the favorite. Martin Van Buren, the former Democratic president, was expected to secure the Democratic nomination. Both Clay and Van Buren made the same fatal mistake. They came out against immediate annexation of Texas, arguing that it would risk war with Mexico and inflame the slavery debate. This was politically cautious and probably strategically correct. It destroyed Van Buren's stances. Southern Democrats who wanted Texas, who wanted the slave state expansion, who had been waiting 9 years for annexation, revolted. They blocked Van Buren's nomination at the Democratic Convention after multiple ballots deadlocked. On the 9th ballot, the convention turned to a candidate whose name had barely been mentioned at the start: James Knox Polk of Tennessee. Polk was 50 years old. He had served in Congress and as governor of Tennessee. He was competent, hardworking, and largely unknown outside of professional political circles. When his name was floated as a compromise candidate, the Whig press mocked him. "Who is James K. Polk?" became a rallying cry for Clay's supporters. It was meant as a taunt. It was a fatal underestimation. Polk's 4 goals. Polk ran on a platform of aggressive territorial expansion, summarized in the slogan, 54-40 or fight, a reference to the disputed boundary of the Oregon Territory, which the United States claimed up to latitude 54 degrees 40 minutes north, putting it in direct conflict with Britain. But Oregon was only part of Polk's vision. He had 4 goals, and he was almost obsessively specific about them. He stated them privately to his cabinet at the beginning of his term. The settlement of the Oregon question with Britain,
the annexation of Texas, the acquisition of California from Mexico, the reduction of the tariff. 4 goals, 1 term, no re-election sought. He achieved all 4.
Polk was, by the measure of his own ambitions, the most successful one-term president in American history. He was also, by the measure of what his success cost, one of the most morally consequential. Annexation, the final push. Polk won the election of 1844 by a very narrow margin. He received just 38,000 more popular votes than Clay out of nearly 2.7 million cast. But the Electoral College gave him a decisive victory, and his win was universally interpreted, especially in the South, as a mandate for Texas annexation. The outgoing president, John Tyler, decided to use the remaining months of his presidency to finish what he had started. He recognized that a direct annexation treaty would require a 2/3 Senate majority and would fail again, so he used a different mechanism, a joint resolution of Congress, which required only a simple majority. The joint resolution passed both houses of Congress in late February 1845, just days before Tyler left office. Texas was offered admission to the United States with the right to divide itself into as many as 5 separate states, a provision that was almost certainly intended to reassure the South about the long-term balance of power in the Senate. Texas accepted. The Republic of Texas voted to dissolve itself and join the United States. On December 29, 1845, Texas was formally admitted to the Union as the 28th state. Mexico's response. Mexico had been watching all of this, and Mexico's response was exactly what everyone had predicted it would be. Mexico broke off diplomatic relations with the United States immediately. The Mexican government's position was clear and had been consistent for 9 years. Texas was not an independent republic. Texas was a rebellious Mexican province. The United States had just annexed Mexican territory. That position was, from a strict legal standpoint, defensible. Santa Anna had signed the treaties of Velasco under duress as a prisoner. Mexico had never ratified those treaties. Mexico had never formally recognized Texan independence. From Mexico City's perspective, the United States had just committed an act of aggression. The American position was equally clear. Texas had been an independent republic since 1836. The United States had the right to accept Texas's application for statehood. The matter was settled. 2 governments, each with a legally coherent position, each refusing to budge, and between them a strip of disputed territory, the land between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, that both sides claimed. Polk was going to use that disputed territory. We'll tell you exactly how in video 29. What Texas was when it joined. Before we close, let's be clear about what the United States was actually absorbing. Texas brought with it approximately 30,000 enslaved people, constitutionally protected under a slave state framework. It brought a Tejano population that had been systematically dispossessed of land and political power over the previous decade. It brought unresolved conflict with the Comanche Nation across its western frontier. It brought $10 million in debt that Texas had unsuccessfully lobbied the United States to assume, and which would remain a point of contention for years. And it brought something else, a border dispute that Polk intended to exploit. The Republic of Texas had claimed the Rio Grande as its southern and western border. Mexico maintained that the Nueces River was the true boundary. The strip of territory between the 2 rivers, about 150 miles wide, stretching from the Gulf Coast into the interior, was, by any honest accounting, disputed. Polk knew this, and Polk had already decided what to do about it. He was going to send an army there, and he was going to wait for Mexico to shoot first. The Republic of Texas existed for 9 years, 4 months, and 12 days. In that time, it produced an enormous amount of political history, military history, and diplomatic history. And almost none of the people who actually lived that history, the people who were not Anglo men with political power, left records that made it into the standard telling. Let's try to correct that. Just a few names, just a few lives. Zay-Ah, Comanche woman. We don't know her name. The name I've given her is a placeholder, a conventional name that appears in some accounts, but we cannot be certain it was hers. She was among the Comanche people present at the Council House in San Antonio on March 19, 1840. When the fighting broke out, she was in the building. She tried to escape. She was killed. Her name is not in any history book. The names of the 12 Comanche chiefs killed that day are known more or less. The names of the warriors killed in the streets are mostly lost. The names of the women killed are almost entirely lost. She came to San Antonio under what she and the delegation understood to be a guarantee of safety. She was killed in a building by soldiers of a government that had violated its own assurances. She deserved better than to be unnamed. Mary Madison, enslaved in the Republic. Mary Madison was enslaved on a cotton plantation near the Trinity River in East Texas. We know her name only because it appears in a single estate inventory document from 1842, when her enslaver died and his property, including her, was assessed for distribution to his heirs.
The document records her name, her approximate age, listed as about 25, and her assessed value in Republic of Texas dollars. It records nothing else about her. Whether she was born in Texas or brought there from the American South, whether she had children, a husband, parents, whether she had tried to escape to Mexico, whether she knew about the world beyond the plantation, whether she survived the decade of the Republic, whether she was alive when Texas joined the United States and slavery became even more legally entrenched than before. We don't know. The document tells us she existed. It treats her existence as a financial entry. She was a human being. She had a life. It happened. Anita de la Garza. Anita de la Garza was the widow of a Tejano rancher who had died in the Texas Revolution, fighting on the Texan side. She held title to approximately 4,000 acres of land in South Texas under a Spanish colonial grant that her family had held for 3 generations. In 1843, an Anglo settler named James Whitmore moved onto a portion of her land with a small part of armed men. He filed a competing claim in the Bexar County Court, arguing that her Spanish land grant was invalid under the Republic's land laws. The case dragged through the courts for years. We know about Anita de la Garza because the court records survive, not because anyone thought her story worth preserving. She eventually lost roughly half her land in the settlement. The records do not tell us where she went or what happened to her family. She was one of hundreds of Tejano families who lost land they had legally held for generations through a legal process that was theoretically neutral and practically stacked against them. Lorenzo. Lorenzo appears in a single document, a letter written by a Texas Ranger officer in 1844 to his commanding officer, describing an incident near the Rio Grande. An enslaved man named Lorenzo had escaped from his enslaver's farm east of San Antonio and had been making for the Rio Grande, trying to reach Mexico. The Rangers had ridden him down after a chase of 2 days. He had been returned to his enslaver. The letter was written to request reimbursement for the Rangers' expenses during the pursuit, the cost of horses, provisions, and time. Lorenzo's perspective on any of this is not recorded. We do not know if this was his first escape attempt, or his third, or his 10th. We do not know if he made it to Mexico eventually, or if he was sold further east, away from the border, where escape would be harder. We know that he ran. That is the entire historical record of his life. He ran. He wanted to be free. That should be enough for him to be remembered.
10 years. That's how long the Lone Star Republic lasted. 10 years of impossible ambition and daily reality. 10 years of a government trying to govern territory it could not fully control, with money it did not have, an army it could not fund, and neighbors, Comanche to the west, Mexico to the south, who had no intention of accepting Texas's claims about itself. What those 10 years actually produced was this: an Anglo-Texan community that had built wealth, but built it on slavery, on the dispossession of Tejano families, on the systematic exclusion of everyone who was not white and Protestant and male from the political and economic life of the Republic. A Tejano community that had helped build the revolution and been rewarded with exile, land theft, and erasure. An enslaved population that had grown from 5,000 to 30,000, constitutionally locked into permanent bondage, watching Mexico, the country Texas had fought a revolution against, as the direction of freedom. A Comanche nation that had demonstrated repeatedly and definitively that it could not be controlled, intimidated, or removed by a Texas republic. The Great Raid of 1840 was not a historical footnote, it was a statement of power. and an annexation, the absorption of all of this and all of its contradictions into the United States that had been accomplished by one determined president who had told his cabinet he intended to acquire California from Mexico as well. James K. Polk had Texas. Now he wanted the rest of it. He sent General Zachary Taylor and his army to the Rio Grande, the disputed border. He needed Mexico to fire first. He needed an incident. He needed an excuse. He didn't have to wait long. On April 25, 1846, a Mexican cavalry force crossed the Rio Grande and attacked an American patrol. 11 Americans were killed, 49 were captured. Polk told Congress that American blood had been shed on American soil. Congress declared war on May 13, 1846. The Mexican-American War had begun.
In video 29, we go inside the decision-making that started the war. We meet Abraham Lincoln, then a first-term congressman from Illinois, who stood up in the House of Representatives and demanded to know the exact spot where American blood had been shed. We meet the Americans who said the war was wrong, and we meet the first men on both sides who would fight it. Thank you for watching Nostalgia History. If you're just finding this series, link to video 27 is below, the real story of the Alamo. Everything in this video builds on that foundation. And if this series is changing the way you understand a history you thought you already knew, that's exactly what it's supposed to do. Subscribe, share, leave a comment with the name from this video that stayed with you.